Okay, so we're recording. You can see that, Dermot?
Yeah, all good.
Ready when you are, Peter. Off you go.
Yeah, so welcome to you all. I know we've got people from all around the world this evening, this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are and whenever it is. So welcome. And we're just hearing a little bit there about the Irish Milers Club, which is very active in Ireland and responsible for developing both middle and long distance and doing a wonderful job. So as I say, welcome to everybody. I won't do an introduction because there's enough of that on the website, but we're going to talk today about priming for performance and recovery. And priming obviously means preparing. So we're going to talk about the preparation. And each and every one of you out there, I know you have your own routines, your own programs for getting your athletes ready for performance and for recovery. So what I want to do is merely kind of present some ideas that I've evolved over the years. And with so many people here, it's going to be difficult to have much of a discussion, but we're certainly going to take some questions as we go along and hopefully kind of provide some food for thought, because each of you has information I wish I could plug into. But what I'm going to do today is share my experiences from going back over far too long, I think 53 years of coaching now. And this work goes back to when I very first started. So I do have a presentation, and the presentation, I'm just going to share. So, as I said, what we're going to talk about today is priming for performance and recovery. And this is a really important factor because there are things that you can do to physically prepare and prime for performance, which actually has the added value of psychologically preparing your athletes for what's to follow as well. So in all of this, underpinning it is finding something which the athletes are able to do, relaxes them, it's a routine, and they know exactly what they're going to do and when. Now, Roger Bannister made this quote a long time ago in 1955, and he said the human body is centered in the head of the physiologist. And this is an important statement in terms of many young coaches look primarily for research for giving them the answers. But when I started coaching, and when some of you may have started coaching, there wasn't the research. And so there's a live mic in there somewhere.
Just sorted it out. Thanks.
So there wasn't the research. And actually, I think we benefited by that because what we did was develop through our own experience and experiment and innovate. And one of the things we talked about was when you are doing a session. Now, each of you who are coaching now probably was an athlete before. And it'll be interesting to see if anybody is coaching who was not an athlete. But any of you who were an athlete, you remember when you did a set of repetitions. When you did repetitions on the track, the first one usually felt a little bit more difficult than the second one. And then the third kind of felt a lot better than the first or second. And so that's the case. Some people react more quickly, but basically I saw that, and I observed that in my own running, and I observed it in athletes when we talked about it. And so I thought, well, what about if you can do the preparation ahead of competition so that when you start competing, it's going to be like doing the third or fourth or fifth rep of a session. And then if you're going to do that for competition, then why would you not do it in training as well? So you'd have a priming activity before you actually got into the repetitions you're going to do. So thinking about this, brought the idea of priming by doing repetitions, extended repetitions. So I started this back in the 1970s. And at that time, I'd watched people preparing for races. And I saw them at the start line doing very short, sharp sprints of maybe 30 to 40 meters maximally. And I didn't think this related to what was to follow. I didn't think it related to the metabolic energy systems they're going to be using for the middle distance and long distance races. And so I started doing extended repetitions to get ready for the race. And at that time, the extended repetitions were 3 times 200 or 2 times 300. And they were at about 3,000 meter pace. So they weren't sprinting, but they were at a good pace. Most of you out there know that 3,000 meter pace is the closest pace to VO2 max pace. And so what we're doing, I thought that that would best get the athletes ready for what was to follow. So if we look at these activators then, getting the oxygen transport system ready for activity, I had these 3 200s. So the athlete would do 200 at 1500 to 3000 pace, but probably closer to 3000 pace. They'd have a minute recovery, passive recovery, time to write a postcard home and have a cup of tea and a bun. And then they would continue with another 200. And that would be the same 1500 meters to 3000 pace. And after a minute, they do the final one. And whether this was before competition or before training, that was the routine to do. And I found that that helped the athletes in what was to follow. So most of you are familiar with what happens when you start running. You start the exercise and the body's requirements is greater than the body's ability to bring in the oxygen. So that yellow area represents an oxygen deficit. And it takes time when you're running, when you're starting a race or you're starting a training session, to get to steady state. So basically what I was trying to do was to accelerate the athletes to their steady state, so they would be accelerated in their preparation. So we look at the terms here: oxygen deficit, the amount of energy which has to be supplied by anaerobic metabolic processes in the early minutes following the start of exercise due to the slow increase in oxygen uptake. So if we go back, it's a question of this yellow area. We want to reduce this yellow area. If we can reduce that yellow area, then we'll reach steady state before this current situation. So this represents, the yellow area represents the oxygen deficit. And then VO2 kinetics just means that your heart and your lungs and your whole body is able to take up oxygen according to its needs. But there's that refractory period, it's a delay. So what we're trying to do is to reduce that delay. So here again is looking at this situation where we've got the start of exercise here, and we've got this oxygen deficit. That was the yellow we saw before. So we've got this oxygen deficit, and it takes time to reach steady state. And what I want to do is to see, is there something I can do in the warm-up that will prepare me for performance? And what I want to do is to move this line. So I want to move that line this way. If I can do that, then the consequence is I will reach steady state sooner. So I want to do something, and I believed that the 3x200s that I had athletes do had that effect of moving the graph to the left. So that was my experiential result from coaching over many, many, many years. And there was no research on that until 2000, when Andy Jones started looking at this situation of VO2 kinetics and what we can do to kind of prepare. And he actually showed that high intensity exercise helps to move that curve to the green area here. And so there is a movement of the curve and it reducing the oxygen deficit. And the high intensity here was relative high intensity. So he arrived at the same sort of idea of 1500 meters to 3000 meter pace was the ideal to push this curve to the left to be able to help the athlete reach steady state in whatever they're doing, whether it's training or racing, sooner. So we did these activators, call them now. Initially, I would do either 3 times 200 or 2 times 300. Now I do 3 times 200 all the time. Some athletes are ready to go after 2 times 200. They're quick responders, or they've trained their VO2 kinetics so they respond more quickly. So I believe there is a training effect by doing this, but 3 by 200 covers everybody I've had in the group. I don't know of any athletes where just 1 by 200 initially is going to produce the correct response. And what Andy Jones found, Dr. Andy Jones found that after you do the activators, you've got a window of about 4 to 8 minutes where you can talk to the athletes, or the athletes can relax and prepare for competition or training. So we've got this period of time. So it's not a question of doing 3 by 200 at 1500 to 3000 meter pace with that minute recovery. And then we've got to go straight into racing or straight into training. We've got a little grace period where we can either communicate with the athletes, or the athletes can mentally get ready for the race that's to follow. So I'm going to come out of here right now and invite any questions from that first part.
Peter, it's Michael here. Can I ask you, would that be for any type of session? For instance, if you were doing a very fast lactate session, or a longer rep for endurance?
That's a really good question, Michael, and it's the nub of the question. It shows an understanding. We're talking about VO2 kinetics here. So if your work is going to be emphasizing the ATP-CP system, then there is no need to do the 3 by 200 ahead of time, because you don't need the VO2 kinetics in the ATP-CP emphasis work. So if I'm doing some maximal speed work, say flying 30 meters, where I'm doing maximum acceleration for 30 meters and then holding maximal speed for 30 meters, I wouldn't do the 3 by 200 before that. But if I was going to some fitness work afterwards, then Michael, that's when I do it then. So if the pace, so if I'm doing some lactate, if I'm doing some acidosis tolerance work, if I'm doing acidosis tolerance work, and I've got some examples later, then I would do the 3 by 200 ahead of those. But like I say, if the emphasis is strongly purely on the ATP-CP, then you wouldn't need to do the VO2 kinetic warm-up ahead of those. But if it's anything which involves the lactate and the aerobic system and their dynamic interaction, then you would do the VO2 kinetic work ahead of time.
Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome, Michael. Any other questions?
Hi, Coach Peter. How are you? In Georgia, Brazil.
I'm trying to look.
Hello.
Do you have your
here
video on? I've got you.
Yes.
Yes.
How are you?
I'm
Fine.
doing well, thank you. Doing well.
Okay, Coach. I have a question for you. You do this type of warm-up for VO2 Connect. After you do this, how much minutes after you do this type of warm-up you need to do the time to start line? For example, I going to 10,000 meters. I do this type of warm-up. After finish, how many minutes I need to connect to go to the start line?
Well, you could go straight to the start line with no problems, but the good thing is the effect lasts for 4 to 8 minutes. In fact, there's suggestions that it can last easily as long as 12 or more minutes. And so it has an effect which you don't have to kind of rush afterwards. It has a lasting effect. So I'll go into that with a slide, a little bit more detail later, George. So that should make it clearer.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Very good to see you.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions for the moment?
Peter, could I just ask, is it more likely if you're a slow twitch distance runner that you will do the full 3 200s, or if you're a fast twitch, you're more likely to do, or sorry, yeah, if you're fast twitch, you're more likely to do maybe 1 or 2, or does the muscle twitch come into that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Joe, and it's something I actually have never really considered, because the athletes I'm working with, I'm dealing with runners, middle distance runners, long distance runners, sprinters sometimes. And I must admit that as a coach, I don't really give much thought to what their emphasis might be, because I try and give a broad brushstroke of everything to each. And so I wouldn't treat somebody who, if they'd had a muscle biopsy and shown that they've got an emphasis in fast twitch fiber, then I actually wouldn't see that their VO2 kinetic, the VO2 kinetics are connected to the oxygen transport system, the lungs, the ability for the lungs to take up oxygen. And so I don't think that is related so much to muscle physiology.
Okay.
Does that make sense, or?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Peter. Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome. Very welcome.
Hey, Coach. Got a question for you, Billy Poole from the U.S. When introducing the repeats before a workout, when will you introduce it? Early part of the season, mid part of the season, or when you're trying to taper or get ready for big competitions?
Why would you not do it year round?
That's why I'm in here.
You not do it year round for every training session you do in reps, for every race you go into. Why would you not do it if it has beneficial effects? And if you believe, as I do, that the athletes get a training effect from every time they do it. So that would be the answer for me, Billy.
Sounds good. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Let's crack on, as they say. And we'll pick up the presentation again, and I'll pause every now and then, like Bashir said, to take some questions. And we're in this situation. Hope you can all see that the presentation should be up, and this is continuing from where we were. And just to recap, we're doing 3x200 at 1500 to 3000 pace. Minute recovery, a passive recovery, and then we've got 4 to 6 minutes. I say that, we've actually got longer than that. We've got 4 to 8 minutes or 8 minutes plus to the next activity, which could be training or racing. So here we have our little squad of 3 athletes doing their 200s, and they finished. And if it's a training session, I then at this point in time explain what is to follow. So I use that time kind of productively for that. I had a group of athletes who, I'm just going to hide that slide for a moment, had a group of athletes who were doing this. And one of the athletes, we got to May, June, and I said, Christina, these look like they're going really easier for you, and I think they're somewhat faster. And she said, well, no, they feel as easy, but they're the same speed as I was doing before. And I said, but we started these in November, keeping a record of it in terms of following it through. And she said, yeah, but I'm running the same speed now as I was then. So it prompted me to go back, because time is never the driver for me. I record everything, but I don't obsess over it. I record it and it's there to look at in the future. But I can see the athletes every week getting better, getting faster, getting more controlled. And so we have this situation where over a 7-month period from November to June, this was the progression that the athletes made in their 3x200. And as you'll see, they had no feedback. So I never call out splits at the track. if they call out a split, then they're focusing on that rather than what they should be doing, which is running. And so what they do is they do the 3x200 in internal thoughts. And then when they finish, I provide feedback with them. So I don't provide feedback from me, as I say, it's with me. So the first thing I'll ask is, were those 200s, tell me about them. And they'll usually say, oh, Joe took that first one out way too fast, or whatever. They'll comment on each other. So they take it in turns to lead. And because they take it in turns to lead, then there's different times because different people are leading. So there's a natural change in times because different people are leading. And that's not a worry. It's all in that range of 1,500 meters to 3,000. Now, some of you like looking at tables and you can get a lot from that, but I prefer graphs because graphs tell me much more what's happening. So the first 200 is the blue line, the red line is the second 200, and the green line is the third 200. And the trend is this, the average is this purple line here. And again, if you look at the trend, that's the progression. So from an average of, if we go back, we look at the average there is back in November, you've got the progression through to June. You'll see the average went from 39.1 down to 36.1. I didn't seek that. That just happens naturally. And so that's something I look for. But I don't use that as the driver. That's a result of what the athletes do with their running. So this goes back to the question we had about competition. What do we do here? So in training, obviously very, very easy. Competition is more of a challenge. We could be at a cross-country meet. We could be at a track meet. So what do we do there? So we need to do our 3x200, but where? And what if there's no track? Well, if there's no track, then I just have them do 3x40 seconds at 1,500 meters to 3,000 meter pace. So 3x40 seconds time duration and a 1 minute passive recovery. So that takes, the whole thing takes about 4 minutes. So here we are with our race. Could be a cross country or a track race. We have this period where we complete our VO2 kinetic warm-up well before the race, here 6 minutes before. So we start our VO2 kinetic warm-up 10 minutes before. So the athletes know that 10 minutes before their race is due to start, or 10 minutes before they go into the call room, they'll do their 3x200 or their 3x40 seconds. And then they just relax, ready for the race. So, as we all know, competition environments can be very variable. Many times, cross-country or road races, the start may be delayed. Well, what we have found and what Dr. Andy Jones has confirmed is that if you do your 3x200, if the start is delayed, you just do a single 200 to reactivate the priming of the VO2 kinetics. So if you're at the Olympic Games, you do your 3x200 on the training, the warm-up track just before going into the call room. And then it doesn't matter if you're 20, 25 minutes in the call room. When you come out onto the track, you do a single 200, and it doesn't have to be a continuous 200. It could be 100 out and turn and 100 back. But the rhythm is at 1,500 to 3K pace, not a fast sprint. And actually, this is what Hisham El Garouj did. I observed him do this in Seville in the final of 1,500. All the athletes came out and the starters marshals were stopping the athletes from doing any warm-up running, except Hisham just slipped past them and did 100 meters down at about that 3K pace and did 100 meters back. And he didn't bother with the officials. He was well away, whereas all the other athletes were trying to do short, sharp sprints in the vicinity of the start and were being stopped from doing so by the officials. So it helps to take control of the situation, and you get that reactivation happening if there is anything which delays the start. So if you're at a cross-country meet, and the start's delayed, after, say it's delayed 10 minutes, then you have the athletes just do roughly 100 meters out at 3K pace, turn 100 meters back, and they're ready, reprimed, ready for the start of the race. But it gives control to the athletes as well. This is an important issue. It's not just about physically preparing, but it's actually having them focused on what is to follow, not panicking, they're in control. So I'm going to invite some questions after that little bit.
We had a couple of questions, Peter, on the chat. So if I just repeat these to you. One was from Rosalind Hamero. Is the oxygen activator, is it suitable for sprinters or 400-meter runners? I think you mentioned about short sprints, but any reflections on 400-meter runners?
It's probably, yeah, it's a really good question, Rosalind, and thank you for that. And it's not going to be so useful for a 100-meter runner, but could be potentially useful for a 200-meter runner, and certainly could be useful for a 400-meter runner, and is essential for an 800-meter runner. So I think that, you know, it depends. I would experiment and see. And I think some athletes will respond more than others, but I think all athletes will respond better over time.
Okay, and I think one of the things you said earlier, Peter, take control of the situation. And I think usually we find that the most successful athletes are those that are in control of themselves, in control of their emotions, and get the job done. And sometimes that involves being having the ability to circumvent or take advantage of a situation. And I think you mentioned Hashim El Garouche when he just found that opening to get his preparation in position. I've also got,
he didn't disrespect the officials. He just very nicely slipped by them and did what he wanted to do.
Quite, yeah. And sometimes people see it as arrogance, but sometimes it's just taking advantage of an opportunity and preparing, not being phased, not being intimidated by the situation, and realizing that perhaps, you know, things could happen. And I think we know that Steve Obert was probably quite useful at utilizing situations. We also got a question from the coach here. How are you measuring the performance differential versus doing a set of strides before training or racing? What it means is, what kind of improvement are we talking about?
We've got a mic open somewhere. John, I think your mic might be open. Thanks, John. Yeah, the set of strides, and I'm not sure what they mean by a set of strides, but the 3x200 is well documented as being the optimal. You know, would 5x200 be better? No, it hasn't shown to be. Is 2x200 better? For most people, probably not. Some people might be able to kind of activate off 2x200, but 3x200 seems to be the optimal trigger for priming the VO2 kinetics. And so I think it's, would a set of strides, I know of no research which compares that. And certainly my experience has been that this works. And I must admit, I tend to use that as a criterion. If it works and it helps the athletes prepare better and race better and feel better psychologically and physically, then that's why we put it in. Any other questions? Any verbal questions?
Sorry, Peter, can I just ask, would the same kind of process then work for somebody going out to do a 15 or 20-minute tempo run and doing 3x200 at the start of it? Would the same process work? Yeah.
That's a really good question, John. And if you're going to go straight into tempo from first step, then yes, it would. But I think most of it, your athletes probably do some sort of easy running before they go into tempo mode. Yeah. So if they're doing easy running and going into tempo mode, it's a really good question. I've never had athletes do an easy aerobic warm-up and then before they do the tempo element, to stop and do 3 by 40 seconds and then doing the tempo. It's a good question. It could be a good protocol. I generally have the athletes I work with, if they're doing tempo, then the lead into it is just gradually increasing rhythm. And I would probably have them at a good rhythm before the tempo starts.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
What sort of pace are you doing on your tempo runs, John?
I average our tempo runs anywhere between, they're very short because they're mostly juvenile athletes or juniors. So they're not running anything over 25 minutes for tempo. So they probably build in for about 10 minutes, go for 25, and then another 10 minutes easy at the end for a bit of a cool down. But you're not talking overly fast. You're probably just talking about 12K, 13K pace for a tempo. Nothing particularly quick.
Okay. Again, that's really good. With the younger athletes, I really emphasize fartlek and rather than tempo, because they don't usually have the concentration for tempo initially. But fartlek, and I even have the younger athletes do, say, for example, 3 sets of 5 minutes of fartlek. So going for good quality fartlek, varying rhythm between, say, 1500 and their cross-country pace, and slower recovery running, but never the J word, never the jogging word during fartlek. And that would be a staple through our winter sessions. Excellent.
Is one good fartlek session a week.
Excellent. How long are they doing their fartlek sessions, John?
Sorry?
How long are they doing their fartlek sessions?
Well, we start off anywhere between 2 minutes or 3 minute reps, and maybe 5 of those, and then work our way up. So we do. So we maybe end up with 3 times 7 minutes or 3 times 9 minutes, but they won't go any further than that.
I'm wonderfully easily distracted, and fartlek is one of my favorite methods of training, but I think we should get back onto the subject in hand. But John, that was really good question, and I appreciate that. And we'll pick up the presentation again then, and we'll go back to where we were, hopefully. Okay. So biokinetic energy is something I'm going to talk about next Wednesday, but biokinetic energy is what we think of in terms of elastic energy. And can we prime that? Well, it involves the whole body kinetic chain. So the kinetic chain runs from the top of our head to the tip of our toes. And if any part of the kinetic chain is out of alignment, then our ability to produce biokinetic energy, the elastic energy, is compromised. And so we want to activate the whole body kinetic chain. And one of the best ways I found to do that is by doing handstands. And I had one coach say to me, well, we're not coaching gymnasts. Well, perhaps we should be. The ability to control the whole body kinetic chain is a requirement rather than an added benefit. If you're going to control the stiffness of the body, and by stiffness, we're talking about how the joints work together to control the storage and return of elastic energy, then we need to have everything in alignment. So if we're thinking about training, then it could be a situation where we're looking at a handstand. This athlete here had never done a handstand before. And this is a very good handstand. You'll see that in track and field, we have the ankle always at 90 degrees. So it's passive there, never pointed toes. This is good, except I would prefer the head to be in neutral alignment. So the upper back here is curved because the head is looking at the ground. And that's a common beginner's mistake. After I demonstrated this, each of these athletes supported each other in pairs to do the handstands. And it's vital that you have the athletes ask permission to support the athlete, but always support by the hips, never support by the ankles or the legs. If you do that, they will tend to collapse. So for safety, you let the athlete come to you and you support them by the hips. So they would do 2 or 3 handstands, and the athletes I work with can all walk around the infield on their hands, and they do that as part of their warm-up. So what else can we do for biokinetic energy in the warm-up? So handstands. Then if we run on surfaces of varying compliance, what does that mean? Well, if we've got surfaces, and I've got a high school near me where they've got a 1,000-meter loop, which incorporates muddy grass, trail, the back straight of the track, and some cement, concrete. So they've got 4 different surfaces. And the athlete, when they run over those surfaces, they adjust the stiffness of their whole biokinetic system to the compliance of the surface under their foot. So they also run in shoes, if they have a variety of shoes with varying cushioning. So for example, I may have an athlete warm up in their very thick shoes, and then they'll do perhaps some short accelerations in spikes, only 2 to 3 times 30 to 40 meters, and then go into racing flats for the session, and then put their thick shoes on for cooling down. So they've had a variety of compliance under their foot. And I'm not even going to begin to get into the additional kinetic element with the carbon plated shoes. That's a whole different issue. But basically, you want your athletes to run in as much variety as possible. And if it's safe and they can do it, and also running in bare feet. So if we do fast sprinting, 2 to 3 times 60 meters maximally, with a 2 to 3 minute walk back, fast sprinting also optimally stiffens the whole body kinetic chain. And so you do all this priming biokinetic work, you do that prior to doing the 3x200. So this would be before doing you prime biokinetic energy production first, and then you prime your VO2 kinetics afterwards. Oops, this is might be of interest. Just go back here. This is what I mean by biokinetic energy. This is what I mean by elastic energy. And I need to. Can you see that, Bashir? The video? I think I may not have shared it correctly. Let me just.
Yeah, I saw the video. It hadn't started though.
Right, but you could see the screen.
Yes.
Okay. So. So this is in Kenya, and we all know the Maasai warriors have got good spring in. And this is biokinetic energy in action. So how many times did he go in the air? Well, I've seen this many times, so I know it's 11. So he does 11 jumps like that. And it's interesting because I've watched a lot of these videos from the Maasai coming out these days. And most of the people, the Maasai, they do it for tourists. And most of the Maasai now can only do 3 or 4 of those bounces. And they don't have the amplitude that this chap had. This chap has got really good biokinetic energy. So he's able to get this height and getting this energy return. So it's looking at the elastic energy stored within that whole body kinetic chain. And that's, why is that important? Because that energy doesn't require any metabolic function. And so if you're running, the better your biokinetic energy, the less metabolic energy you need to run at the same speed. Or for our people, for the same metabolic energy with the higher biokinetic energy, you'll run faster for the same metabolic cost. And so it's an added benefit to performance. And athletes, how many of our athletes could do this? And we probably shouldn't or wouldn't ask them. They might be able to do one or two and probably not getting that amplitude. But if we train for it, could they get better? That's the kind of question to ask yourself and to think about whether that's a possibility.
Peter, if I can just jump in briefly.
Yes, please.
I was just going to say, the thing to notice about that is minimal knee flexion, and the fact that as you practice it, you are training the motor neuron pathways to get the timing right, to optimize and maximize the spring. And obviously the people that don't practice it, i.e. common day Maasai warriors that you referred to, and a few of us in this Zoom meeting, because we're not practicing it, we're not recruiting the muscles as effectively. But minimal knee flexion was the key thing I wanted to highlight there.
Right. So can you see that photograph there? Is the screen showing?
Not yet, no.
Not yet. Okay, so I need to.
Now it has. Now I can see the screen.
Now you can. So this is our Maasai warrior on the start line of the NC2A 5,000 meter final. And this is Grant Fisher. And not surprisingly, he won the race. So here's a good example of an athlete who has natural and or developed biokinetic energy production. They've got a lot of bounce, a lot of elastic return. And so good control of the whole body biokinetic chain there. The other athletes are not quite sure what's going on. So let's look and say, well, what about priming for recovery? We've looked back there, we've seen VO2 kinetic warm-up, we've seen priming biokinetics, but what about after racing and training? What can we do for recovery?
Peter,
So
I was just going to jump in. There's a couple of questions from that last section.
I'm going to come back to those later, Bashir.
Okay, yeah, fine.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to, if you don't mind. I'm going to push on with this, with the, this first part of the graph we saw earlier, and now we're dealing with the right-hand side, the purple side here. And you're all familiar with this term EPOC, which is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And that's how we return and recover. And initially the ATP-CP is recovered very, very quickly, but the acidosis that can stay with us for a while. So what if there was something we could do to move this curve this way and to improve the recovery? So effectively what we're trying to do is get rid of the acidosis. So I thought about that and I thought, well, if running at an easier tempo, like a roll-on in new interval training, helps to utilize lactate, it will also have the effect of clearing acidosis. So running at basically roll-on pace, which I've found for most athletes is about 10,000 meter pace. So doing a roll-on at 10,000 meter pace helps to actively and quickly get rid of the acidosis. So here I decided that the athletes would do 5 times 200. This is built up from my experience over many, many years from the 70s. So they would do 5 by 200 at 10,000 meter pace as soon as they can after finishing training or competition. So they could do something in training which builds up a lot of acidosis. And as soon as possible, I would invite them to do their 5 by 200. After a race, I would ask them as soon as they're capable and just relaxed to go into their 5 by 200. So initially, the response you get from the athletes, you want me to do what? You know, I've just raced, I've just finished, you want me to do what? And I say, no, I want you to do 5 by 200. And I find that the athletes, once they've done it, they realize how beneficial it is. So it's 5 by 200 at 10,000 meter pace with a 1-minute passive recovery. For cooling down takes about 7 minutes, and then you go into the aerobic cooldown. So this is 5 by 200, and this is the response. This is a high school athlete here. So this was the session. It was a time trial, and I invited the athlete to do their 5 by 200 as soon as possible afterwards. And he had by this time done it probably 10 or 11 times after training and racing. And this was his response. The 5 by 200 and the rest of cooldown felt good. The first 200 was hard. I was not feeling good. Then by the 5th, I was fine again. It's crazy how well these help you to recover. And they do. And my experience and other coaches' experience is that the first 200, you don't feel that great. Second 200, you begin to feel better. Third 200, you're feeling much, much better. Fourth 200, I'm having to remind the athletes not to increase the pace faster than 10K because they're feeling so good that they actually want to start running faster. So I keep it back at 10K pace, and they do the 4th and the 5th one. And then they go into whatever is to follow in terms of the cool down. But that is a response from the athlete. And that's a response I have from every athlete who makes this a habit to do this. So it's something to consider that we can actively help the athlete to recover after a race. If I'm at a competition and the athlete's doing, say, a 1500, and then later in the day, the 4 by 400, they'll do the 1500 soon as possible. They'll do their 5 by 200 at 10K pace, and then they'll do a little bit more easy running, and then they'll warm up for their 4 by 4s. And as soon as finishing the 4 by 4, they'll do their 5 by 200 afterwards. And like I say, my experience is that once the athletes have done this, it's something I never have to say to them, what about your 5 by 200? They know how much it benefits them. They just go ahead and do it. So I'm going to give you some examples of training sessions before we move into our last session of questions. So here's a rhythm session. So you do your ramp warm-up, and for those in the UK, ramp is well known, but not so well known around the world. RAMP is an acronym for raise, raising heart rate, A is activate, M is mobilize, and P is potentiate. And I think all of the things I'm talking about in priming deals with potentiation. So it's the P part of RAMP. So here's the rhythm session. I do the 2 by flying 20s to prime stiffness. Then 5 minutes of easy running, and then the 3 by 200. And because they're VO2 kinetic activators, they're at that 1500 to 3000 pace with a minute recovery. And I think Bashir will make this presentation available to everybody who's on the call tonight. Bashir? We'll make so the PDF will be available afterwards. So everything you see here, you will receive. Then I've got this 4 to 8 minutes. I've got this time to explain the training that's going to follow. So then this is where I tell them you're doing 3 by 4 times 500. The 500s are at 5000 pace. There's a 100-meter roll on. So this is new interval training. And there's 3 to 5 minutes easy running between the sets. So this is using the standard IAAF, where the round brackets is always the pace of the repetition and the square brackets is always the recovery. That's the standard IAAF World Athletics nomenclature for training. So you'll see this is lactate dynamics training. This is training the synergistic relationship between the lactate and the aerobic system. And it's training the body to use lactate as a fuel. This usually would be, this is a beginning session. This would usually be 5K, 3K, 5K, 1500, 5K. So that I do different paces within the set so that they're producing different amounts of lactate, and they're training their body to utilize different amounts of lactate within the set. And then the aerobic cooldown. So that's just a simple rhythm session where we're using the VO2 kinetic activators, and we've also primed stiffness. Mentally, always say that there's handstands with that ramp as well. So here's a middle distance runner. Actually, I do this same session with my marathon runners. So all my marathon runners, and any distance, any runner does maximal velocity work year round, because that helps running economy. And we'll talk about that more next Wednesday when we talk about biokinetic energy. But here's a session with maximal velocity. We start with our aerobic warm-up and our ramp. And then now we're doing 2 sets of 2 repetition of flying 20s, which means 30 meters maximal acceleration, 20 meters holding maximal frequency. So they're running maximally for 50 meters. So it's 2 sets of 2 repetitions. And for middle distance and distance runners, that's the sort of quantity I do. I might sometimes go up to 2 sets of 3 repetitions, but I rarely do more than 2 sets because that's not their primary area of development. So this now is ATP-CP training as well as priming stiffness. So we're actually developing the maximal velocity within the session. 5 minutes easy running, then our activators, and then I explain what is to follow. And as a coach, I tell the athletes when they've got their stressor sessions, but I don't give them detail until I'm there on the day. And the reason I do that is because if I change it, they won't know, because I want to be free to adapt the session to where they are for that day and with their feedback. So if I've got something written on a sheet of paper that they've had for 2 weeks, they're all excited about getting there, and it may not be appropriate for them to do what's written on that sheet of paper. So here they're doing some lactate dynamic work, where they're doing 2 sets of 4 repetitions of 200 at 1500 meter pace with a 100 meter roll on, and 3 to 5 minutes easy between the sets. And that's your lactate dynamics training. Again, training the body to create, in this case, a little bit more lactate than you would in the 5,000 meter rhythm. But you're doing the 100 meter roll on to utilize that increased lactate and utilize that lactate as a fuel. And then we do the cool down. So that's a session with maximal velocity. Let's just take another session. This is speed endurance session. Could be suitable for any distance really, but probably primarily we're looking at 800, 1500 athletes for this type of session. And you'll see the whole session there laid out in front of you. You've got the 2 by flying 20s, you've got your 3 by 200, then you've got these 2 sets of 4 by 200, 3 by 300. So you've got 2 sets of 4 by 200 at 800, 800, 400 maximal. So that's your speed endurance work. And then this work afterwards at VO2 max pace is just maintaining VO2 max. So it's kind of a part of the session, but it's fitness work after the quality speed endurance work. So let's unpick that a bit more, because it's quite a big session, but well, not a big session, but what I call these sessions is blended. So it blends various elements in together. So we've got our ramp, we've got our 2 by flying 20s. In this case, it's primarily priming stiffness. It's, then we go into 5 minutes of easy running. Then we do our VO2 kinetic activators. Then we're going to go into explaining what's to follow. We do 1 set of 4 by 200, and that's our acidosis work. So it's built up a lot of acidosis. So we know from our priming for recovery, we're going to do 5 by 200 at 10,000 meter pace to clear the acidosis. That takes about 7 minutes. So instead of doing Many coaches do 8 minutes passive between their speed endurance work. And I find that doing the 5x200 helps the athlete to recover better and to get a better set of repetitions afterwards. So here we're doing, again, one set of 4x200, building up acidosis. And you all know what's going to follow that. It's going to be 5x200. And then 5 minutes of easy running. And then our lactate dynamics work to finish off the session. And then a cool down. So obviously that's the sort of session which we give somebody who's got a training age probably of 5 or 6 years or more. It would be changed. It might have the same elements, but it would be appropriately structured in quantity and quality for the training age of the athlete who's doing the session. So this is, but it shows you how you can take a session and blend various elements into it. And that every time you do priming, every time you do acidosis clearance, you're actually training the body to be better at preparing for competition and recovering from competition. So that's the emphasis there. I'm going to come out of here at the moment and invite questions.
Okay, Peter, I've a couple that came in a little earlier.
Can we get some verbal ones first, please, Bashir? If somebody's got a...
Fitzgerald, have you got any?
Is anybody out there? Can they just unmute their microphone if they wish to, Bashir?
That was my question there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Eve,
yeah.
Yes.
It was just a question on the age that the priming is most beneficial for. Is like, if you're talking about a 16-year-old, is it beneficial? Is it similarly beneficial to a 14-year-old, or are we talking about their developmental and training age?
This work applies to all athletes very much from when they first start running. So I've done this type of work with 10 and 11-year-olds. I've done it with 13, 14, any age really. And I've done it up to less beneficial with masters athletes. But if you've got a younger athlete, the sooner you start this type of work with the appropriate intensities and the appropriate volumes, they will respond. I mean, all of your young athletes should be able to do handstands. And if they cannot, then it's unlikely they're going to be able to get their biokinetic chain in a stable position when they're running. If you can't control your body the wrong way up, it's unlikely you're going to be able to control your body the right way up. So I think that's my recommendation, Neve, is that the age is not a requirement. You don't get to a certain age and then need to start doing this type of work. This type of work can be done right from the beginning of running. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. For that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Brian or Aisling? Aisling's got a hand up. Unmute yourself, Aisling.
Yeah. Hi. Just wondering, why is it less beneficial for masters athletes, or do we know yet?
It's less beneficial, I think, just because their adaptive responses get less efficient as they age. As the body ages, then its ability to adapt generally is not so good. It's not a question of they won't respond, they will respond, but it will probably take longer to respond.
So still worth giving it a try.
Oh, no, I do. I mean, with the masters athletes I work with, I have one masters athlete who can do handstands, very proud of the fact he can do handstands.
I was going to say, do you want to take videos of our next training session when we're all doing handstands?
Yes, please. Send them on to me, Aisling.
I will indeed.
Yeah. And I can remember many of you know the coach Frank Horwell. And Frank Horwell, founder of the British Miners Club, amazing character. I can remember like when he was in his mid-50s, we were in Vancouver, Canada, and he was going to give a training session to the Vancouver running club there. And we'd met in Stanley Park, just Frank and I were there, and we were waiting for the athletes, and there was a park bench. And Frank goes, "I'm going to jump over that bench." And I said, "Frank, should you?" And he kind of did it. He jumped over the bench, and then he kind of turned to me and goes, "I don't think I'll do that again." And it was, but at that age, it was amazing that he had this natural spring still at the age of 55. So it's something I don't recommend that everybody goes around jumping park benches, but the ability to jump a park bench is something which indicates he's probably got pretty good spring.
Thank you. Thanks.
You're welcome, Aisling.
Brian, do you want to ask you a question?
Yeah, Peter, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, when you're talking about kinetic chain, are you referring as well to fascial chain?
Well, the kinetic chain includes the skeleton, the muscles, the ligaments, and all of the recently defined. I mean, the fascial system has only just been refined and defined, and that's because in the last 10 years, we've been able to study the tissues during activity within the body using ultrasonography and other techniques. And so we now know so much more about what's happening in the body, and it's given us a whole new picture. And so when I'm talking about the biokinetic chain, I mean all of the tissues, including the elastic tissues, and a lot of the muscle action is involved in not so much activity, but in stabilizing the biokinetic chain.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking, if you look at the Masai jumper, I suspect that what you're looking at there is a lot more elasticity and fluidity rather than stiffness.
Okay, so tell me what you understand by stiffness, please, Brian.
I think I'm going to have to ask you, when you refer to stiffness, what are you talking about?
Well, I'm not
I was looking at your kinetic chain. I was looking at the kinetic chain, and you seem to have a tight structure.
Right, right. So, Brian, when we talk about stiffness in biomechanics, it relates to the quality. If you imagine if the body was a mechanical spring, and if it was very easily squishable and didn't give much energy back, the stiffness would be too low. If the spring was very, very hard and you couldn't compress it, so you got very little back, then the stiffness is too great. And so what we want is optimal stiffness. And so the body has this ability to adapt to what's under the feet, basically, in terms of changing the stiffness, but that's a trained ability.
Yes.
If you imagine running across a parking lot by the beach, and you're running across the asphalt or the concrete parking lot, and you run onto the sand, if you run slowly, then you can adapt to the new very hyper compliant sand, and you will just become, your kinetic chain will become stiffer on the sand so that it doesn't collapse. If you sprinted across that car park onto the sand, you may well stumble and fall because your body doesn't have enough time to adapt to the new environment. So our body is adapting all of the time to what is under our feet in terms of adjusting stiffness.
Yeah, I suppose I don't come from a biomechanical perspective, but a biotensegrity perspective, where I'm looking at internal movement all the time, as opposed to fixedness inside the body.
Right, and like I say, there has been incredible amounts of research done recently. I did a meta-analysis on about 64 articles recently where I was looking at stiffness, and there's various new structures which we've identified which have a role which was previously not identified. And
absolutely,
I won't go into that here, but that's something I'll touch on certainly next Wednesday.
I'm looking forward to next Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Very welcome, Brian. So any other verbal questions? If not, we'll go on to some of the written. Bashir, do we have any written ones there?
There is one here, to strengthen the kinetic chain sorry, yeah, the kinetic chain strength conditioning would surely develop and strengthen the kinetic chain with strengthening core to help develop stiffness to get kickback. And really, I've said, yes, I agree, in the sense that, you know, press ups is a form of strength and conditioning, and certainly handstands are, and that's going to develop that chain. Anything to add to that, Peter?
Yeah, I think a lot of people mistakenly think athletes should get stiffer. To be stiffer is positive, and it's not always. What we need is optimal stiffness in any environment. If we're too stiff, then we're not going to get the energy return, because we're going to be hitting whatever surface it is, and we're going to be more likely to get bony injuries. So athletes who are too stiff most of the time will be predisposed to bony injuries. If your stiffness is too soft, if you think about it, that spring is too squidgy, then if you're too soft, not stiff enough, then what happens is your soft tissues, your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments must do the work to stabilize. And so you're more likely to get soft tissue injuries if your stiffness is too low. So we're not trying to get stiffer, we're trying to get optimal stiffness all of the time. So it's environmentally specific. And that's why, if you think about what I just said, and this goes against all we've done as coaches for a long time. Coaches, we've been told, run on soft surfaces to prevent injury. Well, actually, we need to run on a variety of surfaces, including cement, so that we train our bodies, our athletes' bodies' ability to adapt their stiffness. The more they can adapt their stiffness, the less likely they're going to get injured from not being able to adapt to the surface they're running over. Can somebody give feedback on that? Does that kind of make any sort of sense?
Sorry, yeah, that makes great sense, Peter. And I think that the discussion we had earlier about somebody who was muscle bound and they were only stiff on one side, that there was an imbalance of stiffness that could also lead to injuries.
Yes, I mean, any imbalance is something you would try and, in these days, to use the language of these days, something we try and mitigate for. I'm not sure what mitigate means, but everybody's using it, mitigate. Yeah, no, imbalance is something you would seek to correct at any time, yeah.
Peter, am I right in asking then, you can develop that stiffness without running on concrete all the time?
So remember, stiffness is an adaptable thing. It's not just a fixed thing. It's not, I want to be stiffer. I want to be able to adapt my stiffness to whatever I'm running over. And so within that means that, you know, having a small percentage of cement in there means that when I run on cement, I'm not going to get injured because I can adapt to that surface. And so it's the same with terrain. We should be running on undulating terrain, because when we go uphill and downhill, our stiffness changes. Yeah. And so it's it goes back to variety, whereas in Eugene, Oregon, we're blessed with about 20 miles of wood chip trails in various places, which are all flat. And a lot of the professional athletes have spent far too long on that. And the more successful ones get off there many times and are training on the bike paths, which are cement, and training on the roads around Eugene, which are undulating. And so they're getting on different surfaces and different terrains. And they're the ones who generally find it a lot easier to keep healthy.
Yeah. No, that's fine. It was that variety I was looking for. So that's good. Cheers.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Bashir, I think we're probably, if there's no more questions, do you want to wrap things up?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks ever so much, Peter, for coming on. I probably didn't get time to fully introduce you, but as you say, your biography on the webpage and the introduction speaks volumes. And I think, importantly, I think what we've listened to tonight spoke further volumes, and hopefully going to help us all optimize performances in the future. Certainly know how better to prime for performance and prime for recovery. And I think particularly the priming for recovery will be a breath of fresh air for a lot of people. As you said, Peter, that first rep after the session, be a sobering thought. But yeah, if there are any more questions, please feel free to shout out now before we do wrap up. What we'll say is next week we have got an introduction to biokinetics, and Peter will elaborate further on some of the things that he's touched on today.
Sorry, can I just ask
one
more question?
last? Sorry, I got one last slide when everybody's finished, Bashir. I've got one last slide just to summarize. But
okay.
John, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just thinking of age of athletes and developing athletes with the priming for recovery. Can you play around? Because I'm just thinking of the number of reps that's involved there that you've got listed. Can you play around with the number of reps there? As in, instead of 5, go for 3.
No.
Does that work?
No, it doesn't. And actually, if you think about it, 5 by 200 is only 1,000 meters.
Yeah.
And you've got a passive recovery in between them. And when your athletes, they may or may not do a cool down run, but they should. And when you add these things up, it's, I can remember Lawrence Seagrave, the well-renowned sprints coach. It used to be when he showed people his warm-up, the athletes could only do his warm-up and then that was it. They couldn't do anything else because his warm-up was so demanding. And yet his athletes were conditioned to that and then could go into. So you can try it and you can say to the athletes, what I'd like you to do as soon as you've finished is to do, you might say, I'll have you do 3 200s. And then after 3 200s, you might say, if they've done them correctly, are you feeling better? And if they say yes, what do you think you might feel like if you did a couple more? And invite them to try that either then or in the next session. So it's always about gradually kind of introducing things rather than we as coaches imposing them, but inviting the athletes to try this for their benefit.
Okay, got you. Thank you. No, that's good.
Peter, I have a question. It's Tom Chorney.
Hey, Tom.
Good to see you. Thanks for the information, by the way. When you say the 2 sets of 3 300s with a 100-meter roll-on, the 100-meter roll-on is the only rest in between those 300s. Is that right?
Hey, we've got a lot of sound coming in from somewhere else.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm at a track meet.
Oh, no, no worries. Okay, Tom. Yeah,
So
yeah, no, for those who want to know about new interval training, then those details are all on my website. And the link to that website will be on the handouts. But basically, you were asking whether the 100 was...
Yeah, asking whether the 100 was the only rest interval in between the 300s.
Right, it's not a rest interval, you know yourself. It's an active roll-on, but that's it, yes. So you 300, 100-meter roll-on, 300, 100-meter roll-on, and they finish with the roll-on at the end of the set because the roll-on is where the training effect takes place. So, yeah. Thank you. Tom.
Thank you.
Good luck for your athletes today.
Thank you.
So I'll finish, if I may, then just with a summary slide. And
yeah, please do. While that's coming up, we've had lots of appreciation for the presentation, Peter. Thanks very much.
Oh, very nice, very nice. So this is just a summary, guys, for what we've been talking about. So before training or competition, our ramp warm-up, and then biokinetic energy production through activating the kinetic chain. So consider that. Consider the flying 20s and 30s for helping to develop optimal stiffness, what's to follow. Before training or competition, your activators, your VO2 kinetic activators, and those are 3 by 200 at 1500 to 3000. And then after training, which emphasizes the lactate system, it's 5 by 200 at 10,000. So it's really important not to mix those up. I had one coach who said, these priming for recovery aren't working. And I said, well, tell me what you're doing. He said, well, we're doing 5 by 200 at 1500 to 3000 pace. And I said, no. It needs to be at 10,000 pace. So to be effective, it has to be at the right rhythm. And then after competition is primarily to clear acidosis. After training is to train the body to utilize lactate as a fuel and to clear the acidosis. So always remember, coaches, that we don't do lactate tolerance training anymore because we don't need to tolerate lactate. It's a fuel. We need to tolerate acidosis, which is the hydrogen ions associated with lactic acid. And it's that acidosis which we need to clear after training and competition. So that, I think, pretty much brings us to the end of the presentation. And again, I apologize that we weren't able to have more interaction, but that's one of the weaknesses of Zoom. It's very difficult. I wish we could all be in the same room and able to kind of workshop things and have a lot more discussion, because I respect each and every one of yours experience and would like to weave that into the whole story as well. But Bashir, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. It's brilliant that, Peter, as expected, professional, to the point, and making people think about areas that I think sometimes we just go through the routines week in, week out, but you've really made us think, and certainly added an additional bow to our armour in terms of training ideas. So thanks ever so much. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Now, as far as the PDF for the presentation, Bashir, it's a large PDF. It's about almost 40 megabytes, I think. So how do you distribute those large files to your coaches?
Well, once you send it to me, I'll get it sorted out. Don't panic, Peter. We have to send it in 2 batches.
But if you want to make it public, please feel free to do that.
Yeah, we can put it, we can put it in the Kinetic Chain and YouTube channel as well.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Bashir.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you,
Okay.
Peter.
Yep, thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. I'll see most of you next week, I expect.
Thanks, Peter. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter from Brazil.
Keep healthy down there, George.
Okay, I am home. I'm safe.